Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing halving year returns. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go to jump in. So, occasionally, we just go take a look at year-to-date performance of Bitcoin in whatever year we are in and try to make some sense of it by comparing it to previous years in prior cycles. And I find it at least somewhat interesting to go through this process every month or so. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of do a recap first on what happened over the last couple of years. So the first thing is in 2022, it played out like a fairly normal bear market year. You can see that this is 2014, this is 2018, and then 2022 ended up ending the year basically right between 2014 and 2018. In fact, if you were to average out 2014 and 2018, what you'll find is that 2022 basically mimicked the average of those 2 years. And so then, after looking at 2022 and again comparing it to 2014 and 2018, we can see that it played out just as it normally does. And then let's go forward another year. So then if we go forward a year and we look at 2023, we can see that it did not really play out in the same way that most pre-halving years play out. And what I mean by that is oftentimes in pre-halving years, you will get some form. Let me overlay pre-election years, right? Same thing, right? This is the overlay of prior pre-election years. Now, the reason why this is so skewed to the upside is because it's including 2011. Basically when Bitcoin was first launching. And so from that single year, it completely skews the results. But if we were to just take a look at the last two, 2015 and 2019, and add those, you can see that last year, Bitcoin actually outperformed the average of the last two pre-halving years. So it played out a bit differently than the prior pre-halving years. But what's fascinating is that while it does not look that similar to prior pre-halving years, although there certainly were some similarities in terms of basically being in the same general range for the middle part of the year. What's more interesting to me is that if you look at the average of the if you look at the average of again the election years, right? So let me pull that up. So if you add on the average of the election years, you can see that in 2023, Bitcoin more or less followed the average of election years, right? So the pre-halving year this cycle looks closer to the halving year than it did to the pre-halving year, right? It certainly doesn't look like the bear market years, and it certainly doesn't really look like, either individual bear market years. It's not that close to, say, if you look at 2015, you can see that it looks quite a bit different. If you look at 2019, you can see that it looks somewhat different, right? There have been some people that have pointed out, and I would agree with this, that if you look at 2015 and compare it to 2023, there actually are more similarities than I think initially meets the eye. And I think one of the reasons why 2015 looks so bad compared to 2023 is that initial drop off, right? But if this drop off had actually occurred in the prior year, at the end of the prior year, then 2015 might actually have looked a lot more like what we saw in 2023, right? Where it gets kind of boring in this phase, and then you get a rally sort of going into the end of the year. So I did want to at least make that point. So then that brings us to 2024. And what we're going to do in 2024 is we're simply going to see what is it following the closest, right? Now, we can also go through the same exercise of looking at prior halving years. It is a halving year. We should look at prior halving years to see how it plays out. We can first look at 2012, So still in the ballpark of what 2012 did. We can look at 2016 and we can look at 2020. And actually, right now, it's underperforming 2020, but outperforming 2012 and 2016. And if we take the average of those years, you get something that looks like this. So at this point, 2024 still looks, generally speaking, how it normally looks at this point in a halving year, right? On average, the ROI of Bitcoin year to date at this point in the halving year is up about 11%. And we're up this year closer to around 17% year to date. So far, Bitcoin is still very much in line with what normally happens in the halving year. And actually, going into the halving year, we said, hey, normally what you get in halving years is before the halving, you get a dip, right? You can see that in 2012, we got a dip going into the halving. 2016, the same thing. 2020, the same thing. Although 2020, yes, it was a black swan. But in all cases, there was, a 10 to 20% drop, if not more, below the yearly open before the halving occurred. And so in all prior cases, after about 100 days, the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin was still about 1, right? We're currently on day about, in the mid-50s, right? But I thought that was interesting that in all halving years, right after the first 100 days, basically the price of Bitcoin hadn't really gone anywhere. But then I thought, well, are there other years we could compare it to, right? And I think there's reason to think, hey, maybe we should, especially considering that you could make a case that the average of the halving years looks more similar to 2023, at least by the end of it. So what if we were to compare 2024 to some of the post-halving years? Is it following suit or is it not? And in that scenario, I think we'd first have to pull up 2013. That was the post-halving year after the 2012 halving. And you can see that it's not keeping pace with 2013, not by any stretch of the imagination, right? I mean, at this point in 2013, Bitcoin was already up more than 2x off the yearly open, where right now Bitcoin's only up about 17%. I mean, for Bitcoin to be up 2x off the yearly open at this point, just to give you an idea of how insane it was in 2013, right? The yearly open was 42K, right? So in order for Bitcoin to be keeping pace with what was going on in 2013, it would have to be, well over 80K. It's clearly not there, and so it certainly is not keeping pace with 2013. So then why don't we compare it to 2017? One thing we've talked about before is that from one cycle to another, there is some element of diminishing returns. So we shouldn't really expect it to keep up with 2013, right? I mean, that would be insane because in 2013, Bitcoin ultimately went up almost, it went up like 83x from the yearly open. And even the most bullish of bulls, I think, would concede that Bitcoin will likely not be going up 83x in 2024. But why don't we take a look at 2017? So if you look at 2017, you can see that so far we're actually following it quite closely, right? We're actually following 2017 quite closely. And if we were to continue to follow 2017, which again, I have no idea if we will, but if we were to continue to follow it in the short term, what it would entail would be, going slightly higher and then dipping down again. That's what at least happened in 2017. And what that would look like for Bitcoin would be, sort of like something we talked about as something to at least keep on your radar. And that's this idea of Bitcoin, after it gets these large moves up, right? It consolidates for a few weeks, right? And then gets another push higher, and then it bleeds back to the bull market support band, right? We saw that happen back over here, and could happen again, right? We've seen that happen many times where after a large push up, consolidates for a couple of weeks, then puts in a slightly new high, and then fades back to the bull market support band, right? We've seen it happen a number of times, right? In fact, in all three prior cases, right, where we saw significant moves up, right? Big move up, consolidate, slightly higher high, down to the 20-week, right? Big move up, consolidate, slightly higher high, down to the 20-week. And I get over here, right? Big move up, consolidate, slightly new high, and then down to the 20-week moving average, right? So in all three of these cases, after you get that impulsive move higher, we saw a few weeks of consolidation that ultimately led to a slightly higher high before then revisiting the bull market support band. So if it were to play out like that, right, if you were to look at the year-to-date ROI, if it were to play out like 2017, at least in the early part of the year, then that's what would ultimately happen, right? Further consolidation, a slight push higher, followed by a correction back down, still potentially before you get to the halving, right? But again, when thinking about a pre-halving dip, sort of when we started the year, we arguably have had one, right? I mean, again, we've had a 20% drop. And I know there's people out there that want more, and it's possible we get more, right? But it is still, at this point, it's still in line with the prior drops that we saw. And again, for those that want a larger drop, by the time you get one, right, by the time you get a larger drop, it could signal an actual reversal in the trend. Just like we've seen, I mean, in a lot of these impulsive moves, right, that don't get large drawdowns, by the time you finally get, a 30% drop, it actually potentially signals a reversal in the trend. And so looking at the year-to-date ROI, so far it's following 2017, but also so far it's following the average of the halving years, right? So I don't really think that it looks that dissimilar from either one. I do think, we probably need a little bit more data on this to really identify what it's following the closest. But actually in both cases, right, whether it was following the halving year, the average of the halving years, or 2017, there was still another pullback before the halving. Again, I don't know if we're going to get it or not. I'm just showing you what the data is looking like. And then I was thinking, there's of course a lot of people that are looking at it as not compared to 2017, right, but as compared to 2016. Looking at this move over here, right, sort of breaking out. See, the thing is I know a lot of people are looking at this one right here, right? So like the ultimate breakouts that it had. But while that might be the case, Bitcoin hasn't really retested that range, right? Like, so over here, Bitcoin retested the breakout point, right? And over here, it retested the breakout point. It hasn't done that here, right? Like, it hasn't retested the breakout point. And so, it certainly could, right? It certainly could. I'm not going to be the one to say that it can't. I think that's always a likely potential outcome. But note that it hasn't happened yet. And so I think that's why it's worthwhile to keep an open mind about it, is because that actually hasn't happened yet. And if it follows, if it follows 2017 or even the average of the prior halving years, that wouldn't necessarily, again, if it were to follow 2017, it wouldn't go deep enough to hit it, unless it's on like a wick, right? Unless it's on like a wick. So I do think that's worthwhile to consider. And then I was looking at monthly returns, and if you guys remember, like, most Septembers are red for Bitcoin. Most, not all, but most. And what's interesting is after we got a green September, you can see that October, November, and December were in fact green. And then January and February were also green. I was like, has that ever happened in history? And there's been a couple of times, right? There's been, you can see there's been 3 prior cases where we had a green September. So let's see what happened next, right? So in 2012, after a green September, we then had a red October, and then we did green, and then, for November, December, and then January, February, March, and April were all green. But that doesn't really look like what's going on now, as we showed earlier, right? We're well below what happened in 2023 or 2013. You can see that in 2013, January was basically flat, whereas in 2024 it was flat, but in 2013 it was up quite a bit. So that brings us up to the 2015 green September, which then led to green for the rest of the year. just like it did in 2023, right? And then in 2016, we had a red January and then a red March. We haven't gotten to March, but again, this was not a red January. It was, in fact, a green January. And so, yes, I mean, it's certainly possible that we are following, the 2016 route. There has been some deviation there, but also note that the halving is a bit earlier in the year, so that could certainly play a role. But I do think that was something to point out. But so far, the one that mimics it the closest is the 2016, right? So look at 2016. It was a 6% green candle. This was 4. Then this was 15% almost. This was, so this was 15%. And then back in 2023, it was about 30%. So 2023 was even more impressive. And then November was green, just like there. And then December, right? December was green, just like here. And then if you go to 2017, you can see it was slightly green, just like 2024. And then the second month of the year in 2017 was about 23% up. We're currently about 21% up. What's interesting is in March, we ultimately had a drop in 2017 by about 9 to 10%. But we know that it first had to move higher before it had that 10% correction. So I think it's important to keep kind of eyes on this, because in one sense we would expect diminishing returns, right? I mean, I don't expect it, never would have expected Bitcoin to keep pace with 2013, and I don't think it will. I don't ultimately expect it to keep pace with 2017, right? Even though it's keeping pace so far, I don't think it ultimately will, because it would imply, a 20x move off the yearly open, which I unfortunately, I don't think will happen this year. And it's one of those things that I think even the most bullish people would likely say is not the most likely outcome for Bitcoin this year, would be, that sort of a move. So I would expect it to ultimately underperform post-halving years, even if it were to continue to emulate it for a while. And if you actually look at the average of those post-halving years or post-election years, you can see that it is underperforming the general average. So that's just something, ultimately something I think that's worthwhile to keep in mind when we think about, how is Bitcoin performing right now with respect to prior years in the cycle. And I mean, at this point, I still think it looks similar to the average of the halving years, but also it still looks somewhat similar to the beginning of 2017. It also looks somewhat similar to, I think there was another year that I found that it looks somewhat similar to. Let me hide them all. Here's 2024. Let's just go through the list, right? Here's 2023. So 2023 was outperforming it. 2022 obviously was underperforming it. 2021 outperforming it. 2020. So yeah, it's pretty close to where we were in 2020, which was a halving year. 2019 outperforming it. 2018 obviously under. 2017, yeah. So 2017 and 2016, even 20. I mean, a lot of them look somewhat. I think the thing with these analogs that will definitely be sure to sort of trip people up is that, in general, right, risk assets that are not just, bleeders that sort of just wither away and die, right? They generally trend higher, right? I mean, it's the whole idea behind the stock market, right? It generally goes up. It needs a reason not to go up because of all the passive investing, right, through 401ks and whatnot. So markets need a reason to go down, not a reason to go up, right? Because there's just people that blindly DCA no matter what. So you really need something to cause it to go down. So that's sort of the danger of looking at any prior analog and saying, well, that looks similar, right? It must play out like that. That generally doesn't happen, right? I mean, oftentimes things look similar just because markets trend, right? And then eventually they deviate. So while we can look at 2024 and compare it to 2017, or compare it to 2020 or even 2016 and say, hey, look, kind of similar, note that there's really not a single year in Bitcoin's price history that looks identical to another year, right? I mean, even prior pre-halving years, they all look different, right? They all look different. Prior election years, 2012, 2016, 2020. they all ended up in different spots. And the path to getting there was very different, right? 2020, we had a massive drop that retested the lows. 2016, we had a drop pretty early on. And in 2012, we also had a drop. But I mean, you can see that the extent of the moves, they occurred at very different times. For instance, in 2012, we had a pretty large move up early on, or sorry, about mid-year, and then we didn't really take that high out for the rest of the year. Whereas in 2016 and 2020, we were putting in new highs even in Q4. So they all look different at the end of the day, right? And none of them follow the trajectory forever. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that it does. And again, because of diminishing returns, we should expect sort of a difference in the overall trend, even if it were to emulate these years, right? Like 2017, I wouldn't get your hopes up and assume it's going to follow suit the whole year, just like it's already not following suit with 2013, right? And then, of course, there's obviously things that could, cause us to deviate, just like when you had something like 2020, right? I mean, the whole market crashed and Bitcoin dropped, at least from its 2019 highs, it dropped 72% from the pre-pandemic high. It was more like, I don't know, like a 60% drop or so. So certainly things can throw you off course. It's the same idea behind like the stock market, right? I mean, like, look at the stock market year-to-date ROI in the current year, right? 2024, and you can compare it to 2020 and 2016 and 2012 and 2008 and 2004 and 2000 and so on, right? I mean, yeah, most years it generally trends higher, but 2000 and 2008 were exceptions, right? And look at 2001, right? And then compare that to 2005. There's also, of course, 2009, 2013, 2017, and 2021, right? So most of these post-election years generally trend up, right? And they end the year up between 20 to 30% for the S&P. I mean, 2009, 2013, 2017, and 2021, right? So, I mean, legitimately 4 post-election years in a row, which again is not this year, that'd be next year, right? But 4 in a row ended the year up between 20 to 30% or so off the yearly open. 2005 did not. It was a relatively boring year in the stock market. It barely ended the year positive. And then 2001, we ended the year below the yearly open. Of course, that was a recession. So this goes to show, right, that, yeah, generally speaking, the market, right, the S&P trends higher. Every once in a while, something happens and throws it off course. So the same thing could, of course, happen with Bitcoin, right? So I do want people to be aware that, there's these general trends with Bitcoin that occur in bear market years, in post-halving years, and pre-halving years, and even the halving years, right? But just like we saw with 2020, sometimes things can get thrown off course, just like with the S&P. Sometimes things can get thrown off course. So we'll continue to just follow to see what Bitcoin does. If it continues to emulate 2016 or 2017, that'll be interesting. And we'll see what happens in March. If it gets any type of a pullback before the halving, or if we just keep on going up. But I did think it was worthwhile to check in here with Bitcoin and kind of see what it's doing going into the halving. And maybe while we're here, we could even briefly check in on Ethereum and see what it's doing. If we look at 2024, you can see that ETH is up about 27% or so, or 29% off the yearly open. 2020, it was actually up a lot more at this point off the yearly open. It was up about 70% off the yearly open in 2020. And in 2016, by this point, it was up even more, right? So, I mean, it's kind of like, you can see the diminishing returns in action, right? I mean, like, it's sort of the same thing, right? That you're kind of looking at with Bitcoin when you compare it to 2013 and 2017. ETH in 2024 is underperforming 2020 and underperforming 2016. So that's, somewhat interesting. And then, we could also look at ETH in, compared to 2023. It was actually outperforming so far. 2021, 2019, and then 2017 and 2016. All right. So, and maybe another one to look at will actually just be total market cap, and then we'll wrap it up. So here's total market cap in 2024 compared to 2020 and 2016 and 2012. So if we actually take the average of election years for total market cap and overlay it with 2024, this is exactly where it was on average. I mean, look at that. On average, by this point in the halving year, total market cap, year-to-date ROI, was exactly at this level, right? I mean, more or less. Right around 14, 15, 16% or so. About 15%, plus or minus a percent, off the yearly open by day 55 or 56 in the halving year. This is where total market cap has been. So pretty interesting statistic. So I think we'll probably wrap it up there. We covered what I wanted to cover. I think the only other thing was, yeah, like just kind of seeing what happens in March, right? I mean, because so far Bitcoin has followed. Oh, there was one more thing I wanted to show, and that was the monthly candles, right? So if you look at the monthly candles for Bitcoin, what you'll see is that, you know, we had a sort of a small candle body over here with long wicks. Same thing right here, right? Small candle body with long wicks. And then the following month, back over here in March 2023, was a 23% move up. Currently, we're up about 21%, but if you go up to the top of the wick, it's about a 23% move up. And then what happened the following month was a slight move higher, but not a lot, right? Only a slight move higher. So that's why I'm saying it might be interesting to see if these patterns repeat, or if they don't. And if when it did have that slight move higher from that top to then where the, you know, to where when we had a wick down there, that was about 12%. A 12% drop, but again, it did end up closing the month green regardless. So, anyways, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. We will continue to follow this, hopefully on a monthly basis, where we'll sort of update these yearly returns or election year returns and make comparisons and see, do they continue to follow suit or are they deviating at some point? So anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.